As residents of Las Vegas can and do attest, it's not all sequins and showgirls. Once you get away from the glitz and out of the view of the sphere, it's a lot like any other city where people live their day-to-day lives. They get up, exercise, go to work, raise their kids, and pay taxes in the usual cycle of adulthood. Once you get away from the Strip, they've got just as many strip malls with inexplicably successful mattress stores as the rest of us. There's one extraordinarily helpful advantage they've got on the rest of the country, though. It's a city famous for excess and open container laws. It is, perhaps, a little easier to hail a ride in an Uber, a Lyft, or a cab. In 2019, Air Force Staff Sergeant Alton decided it was either not cheap enough or not easy enough to do that, and instead elected to drive the 2 miles home from the bar. It's a decision that cost Felix McNair his life. This is Conduct and Becoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. In May 2019, 26-year-old Staff Sergeant Brian Alton worked at Creech Air Force Base, his assigned duty station. Creech is located near Indian Springs, Nevada, and it's different than the Nellis Air Force Base, which I suspect most people think about when they think of air bases near Las Vegas. Creech began its life as a small training site in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack, and was used by the then U.S. Army Air Force Group. In March 1942, Creech got 3 graded earth landing strips and a plan to construct a more permanent facility. But both Creech and Nellis Air Force Base became inactive in 1947, drawing down after the armistice ended World War II. Both went active again in 1949 as the United States slipped into the Cold War. Creech, ever adapting to the times and the needs of the Air Force, now plays host to a fleet of remotely piloted aircraft. Given the proximity to the abundant housing and dining options in Las Vegas, it makes sense that airmen stationed at Creech live and partake in all that Las Vegas has to offer. On Thursday, May 2nd, 2019, Alton finished work for the day and drove to his friend's apartment, Airman First Class William Marable. Alton picked up Marable and drove to a bar about 2 miles away from Alton's own home in northwest Las Vegas. The bar is sometimes described as a bar and sometimes described as a pizza joint, but given that they arrived pretty late in the evening, I'm going to continue to refer to it as a bar. They arrived at the bar shortly before midnight and made up for lost time. In a 4-hour span, Alton drank 2 12-ounce beers, 3 16-ounce beers, 4 shots, and 2 cocktails. This all amounts to at least 12 servings of alcohol. At 4:11 a.m., Alton began driving himself and Marable the 2 miles back to Alton's home. The drive took approximately 4 minutes. It would have taken longer had he respected the speed limit. Marable was in and out of consciousness on the ride. He'd consumed about the same amount of alcohol as Alton, but while he rode, eyes closed, drunk, and beginning to fall asleep, he heard Alton begin repeating in a voice that was somehow both shocked and monotone, "I think I just hit someone. I think I hit someone." Even after making that observation, Alton did not stop. He continued on to his house, where he deftly backed into his driveway at approximately 4:15 a.m. After Alton and Marable climbed down from Alton's truck, they inspected the front of the Ford F-150. They found the driver's headlight assembly missing, a significant bend in the driver's side front bumper, and blood. The blood covered a significant portion of the truck, including inside the wheel well. Alton retrieved a rag and a spray bottle and began to clean the blood from his truck. Then Alton told Marable they had to go back. Don't get your hopes up, it was neither to offer aid nor to take accountability. Alton was concerned that perhaps some of the pieces that came off of his truck might have a VIN on them. He didn't want to leave anything at the scene that could be tracked back to him. So Alton and Marable walked and jogged back along their route and found the body of 65-year-old Felix McNair Jr., lying at the side of the street near the intersection of North El Capitan Way and Horse Drive. Neither Alton nor Marable checked Felix for signs of life. Felix McNair exercised early most mornings by walking around his neighborhood, a little something to get the body moving and warmed up for the day. Prior to his retirement, he served in the Army for 30 years, retiring as a sergeant major. I can't help but think about how safe he probably felt at 4 a.m. Surely the worst of the drunks were pedestrians down near the Strip or downtown. By 4 a.m., you kind of expect that people have already gone home and gone to bed. People up and at 'em at 4 a.m. are normally people beginning their day. Getting back to Alton, Marable, and Felix McNair. Felix's body wasn't at the point of impact. He'd been struck by Alton's truck near the middle of a well-lit crosswalk bisecting a 4-lane road. But his body was approximately 130 feet from the crosswalk. An accident reconstructionist estimated Alton was traveling approximately 60 miles per hour in the 35 mile per hour zone. Nothing in the physical evidence so much as suggested that Alton slowed down or attempted to stop before killing Felix. The force of impact from Alton's car severed Felix's right leg at the hip, and his right leg rested some distance from the rest of his body. This severe collision killed Felix almost instantly. The crosswalk and roadway were littered with debris from Alton's truck, which Alton and Marable began to pick up. They tried to work out how best to dispose of them. A bicyclist, also presumably out for his morning exercise, approached the intersection. Alton and Marable panicked. They stashed the truck pieces they'd already gathered in some nearby bushes. Then another bicyclist arrived on the scene. Alton and Marable explained to the bicyclists that they were walking home from a bar when they themselves came upon the accident scene. They said they'd summon emergency services so that the bicyclists could get back to their morning exercise, and the bicyclists left. Then the two continued collecting truck pieces and carried them back to Alton's house. As you've likely guessed, they didn't summon police to investigate the act they were desperately trying to conceal. They lied so the bicyclists would leave. After arriving at Alton's house carrying fragments from the front end of his truck, they stashed the pieces in Alton's girlfriend's car. Where was Alton's girlfriend in all of this? Unclear. Could she have been the DD? Maybe. But we're not going to blame her for his decisions. Everything Alton and Marable did leading up to this was reprehensible, and the act they took next is no exception. After stashing the pieces of his truck in his girlfriend's car, Alton, who had literally just killed a man while driving drunk, got behind the wheel of his girlfriend's car and drove 15 minutes towards Mount Charleston. Once he hit remote desert, he stopped, and Marable threw the pieces out so they would not be found. Then Alton drove home. Both Alton and Marable went to sleep upon their 5:35 a.m. return. But one of the bicyclists who'd stopped at the site of Felix's death and was then waved off by Alton and Marable hadn't just continued merrily on his way, forever traumatized by the scene he'd happened upon. He rode his bike 2 blocks to a spot where he often saw police officers stationed. Finding no police there so early in the morning, he returned to the scene of the accident. He expected to find Alton and Marable there summoning emergency services themselves. Instead, he found no one. The bicyclist called the Las Vegas police and waited with Felix's body until they arrived. And when the police arrived, they found more truck debris and surmised Felix had been struck by a vehicle. They began canvassing outwards from the scene and found Alton's truck, now parked across the street from his house, no longer backed into the driveway. Officers ran a check on the license plate, discovered the severely damaged truck belonged to Alton, and knocked on his door by 6:30 with some questions. Alton told them he didn't know what happened to his truck, that he'd left it parked in the driveway and didn't know how it had become damaged or parked across the street. He also said he hadn't been at the bar the night before. At 7:15, after being advised of his Miranda rights, Marable told the Las Vegas police what they already suspected. Alton hit something. Marable said they didn't know for sure what they hit, which we all know is a lie, and that he'd just run inside and tried to go to bed when they'd gotten to Alton's home. Another lie. Marable later confessed to his actions to Air Force special agents. The Las Vegas police arrested Alton. He was arraigned and held on $150,000 bail. Shockingly, in spite of his assurances to the police that he hadn't been out at a bar in the early morning hours of May 3rd, surveillance from the bar showed when Alton and Marable arrived, how much they drank, and what time they left. Neighbors' security and doorbell cameras captured the return to Alton's home, cleaning the truck, leaving in the girlfriend's car, and their eventual return. The Clark County prosecutor transferred the case to the Air Force, who began working the investigation and prosecution. Eventually, Alton pled guilty to one specification of conspiracy to obstruct justice and 2 specifications of obstructing justice. At General Court-Martial in June 2021, Alton proceeded on the contested charges: 1 specification of wrongfully leaving the scene of an accident, 1 specification of drunken operation of a vehicle resulting in injury, 1 specification of drunk driving for his girlfriend's vehicle, and 1 specification of involuntary manslaughter. He was convicted of all the charges and opted to be sentenced by the judge alone. The judge sentenced him to confinement for 14 years, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, reduction from E5 to E1, and a dishonorable discharge. Marable, for his part, accepted a plea offer and pled guilty to 1 specification of conspiracy to obstruct justice and 3 specifications of obstruction of justice. The obstruction charges were for, first, removing pieces of the truck from the scene, second, lying to the bicyclists about calling the police, and third, discarding the pieces of the truck in the desert. The military judge sentenced him to a dishonorable discharge, confinement for 12 months, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and reduction from E3 to E1. On appeal to the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals, the AFCCA, Alton made 5 assignments of error. Today we'll talk about his contention that the Air Force didn't actually have jurisdiction over him at the time of his court-martial. During the initial sessions of Alton's court-martial, the military judge noted that the charge sheet itself reflected an end of active service date of November 26, 2018. The judge made this observation on June 6, 2021. The accident, for those who don't like to math, was in May 2019, or 6 months after Alton's term of service was set to expire. The judge first asked trial counsel if Alton was still on active duty. They responded that Alton had received extensions of his orders and his service, and was also continued on active duty through an administrative hold. Of course, the prosecutors are interested in the answer being yes. They wanted to make sure that Alton was appropriately prosecuted for killing Felix. So the court-martial judge inquired of the defense counsel, Did they have any concerns about the status of Alton's service? They did not. Defense never challenged the court-martial's jurisdiction over Alton. On appeal, Alton contended that he wasn't actually in the Air Force at the time of his court-martial. To support his contention, he submitted a copy of a DD-214, or discharge paperwork, that indicated Alton had a separation date of March 3, 2020. He also attached a series of email communications between his defense counsel, his first sergeant, the Creech Air Force Base staff judge advocate, finance personnel, and others about his pay. He then attached a printout of his 2021 W-2, though the opinion doesn't reflect what that document actually said. The government also attached a series of exhibits to their responsive pleadings. Together, these documents painted a picture. On the day Alton killed Felix, he had already exceeded his original 6-year term of service. For non-misconduct-related reasons, he'd been extended to November 2019, a year past the original end of active service date and 6 months after Felix's death. After the Clark County prosecutors handed the case over to the Air Force for investigation, Alton's unit informed him that he would be held on administrative hold and could not separate from the Air Force during the investigation. In June 2019, the legal office, recognizing that it wasn't going to be just an investigation, requested an administrative hold for 180 days. Between June 19th and June 2021, the legal team submitted a total of 11 requests to continue Alton's service. To continue it so they had jurisdiction and could prosecute him. The requests often had overlapping periods of time, presumably because they didn't want to risk a lapse. When November 2019 came and went, Alton informed Air Force Personnel Center of his intention to separate from the Air Force. He received his DD-214 worksheet, which he completed, and received a DD-214 indicating a separation date of March 3, 2020. But Alton continued showing up for everything he was required to, and he never completed the bingo board of out-processing. Sometimes there were disruptions to his pay, but those emails he submitted demonstrated how diligently everyone worked to get him his pay. Trial counsel, defense counsel, his unit, and the finance personnel all agreed he should be paid, because he still worked there. And they all made sure that he did get his paycheck. So it's a little disingenuous to argue on appeal that Alton didn't think he was still in the Air Force and was not subject to the Air Force's jurisdiction. On appeal, the government responded that Alton was never finally discharged from the Air Force. They could show all of that with the documents they submitted with the appellate briefing. But very little, if any, of their proof existed in the trial record. On appeal, the AFCCA had to decide whether the precedent set in the United States v. Jesse barred them from considering documents outside of the, quote, entire record. In Jesse, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces defined the entire record to include the record of trial, matters attached to the record, and briefs and arguments regarding matters in the record of trial. There are 2 exceptions to this general rule. First, military appellate courts can supplement the record when it's necessary to resolve claims of ineffective assistance of counsel. Second, appellants can supplement the record when asserting claims of cruel and unusual punishment. But in Alton's case, there weren't claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, and there weren't claims of cruel and unusual punishment. The AFCCA has recent experience with materials outside the record, and in a series of cases decided that they could consider the material offered by parties on appeal. In Alton's appeal, they concluded that the military judge asked those questions at trial and that those questions raised the issue of whether Alton was still a service member. So, the documents came in. Alton certainly believed he was still in the Air Force when his defense counsel lobbied for his paycheck on a number of occasions. He certainly believed he was still in the Air Force and entitled to that money when he deposited those checks. While he did receive a DD-214 after completing his worksheet, he never received a final accounting of pay. He didn't complete his separation health physical exam to screen for disability, traumatic brain injury, or PTSD. He didn't complete a final dental exam or get cleared by supply. I'm not sure if the Air Force is as picky as other branches about their gear. But usually, the military owns you until you account for every item of issued gear. Further, Alton never received separation orders. And beyond the paperwork side of things, Alton acknowledged that he was still in the Air Force by showing up for work, by performing his duties as directed, and by continuing to participate in and acknowledge his annual performance reports. In short, while the DD-214 weighed in Alton's favor, the totality of his circumstances indicated not only that Alton was still in the Air Force on paper, but that he still believed himself to be in the Air Force. Because Alton was still active duty at the time of the court-martial, the Air Force still had jurisdiction over him. He didn't get out of the brig on jurisdictional issues. Alton also asserted on appeal that a sentence of 14 years of confinement was inappropriately severe. The military judge had sentenced him to the maximum term for 4 of his 7 convictions, and that seemed unfair to Alton. Alton believed that the military judge hadn't taken into account his sincere demonstration of remorse, as evidenced by pleading guilty to obstructing justice and conspiring to obstruct justice, and his unsworn statement filled with expressions of regret and sorrow. He said he'd completed 3 deployments and that merited consideration. So he asked the AFCCA to reduce his confinement term to a total of 8.5 years. The AFCCA declined. They observed that it was reasonable for the military judge to max him out on various convictions, taking into account Alton's decision to drive after consuming at least 12 servings of alcohol, his decision to speed while driving drunk, his inattentiveness while driving, his decision to flee the scene of an accident, once in the vehicle and once on foot, his decision to drive drunk again in order to hide evidence, and his decision to lie to the police when they came knocking. They concluded it was reasonable to be unpersuaded by Alton's supposed mitigating factors. From what I can put together, Felix McNair likely served between 1972 and 2002. He likely enlisted or was drafted during the final years of the Vietnam War. He served during the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and the start to the War on Terror, along with a variety of other military actions in which the United States became involved. I can't find much about Felix's service, but I'd wager dollars to donuts that he contributed more in his 30 years of service than Alton's 6. I'm not personally persuaded by Alton's deployments as a mitigating factor. You can be both a good airman and a killer. They're not mutually exclusive. Marable made his own appeal to the AFCCA. He asserted that the 12 months of confinement and dishonorable discharge were inappropriately severe. He argued that he wasn't the one who fatally injured Felix McNair, and further claimed that being only 23 years old at the time of the killing, and his general character letters, made it clear that a dishonorable discharge was not appropriate. The AFCCA told him to pound sand, but nicely. While they recognized that Marable didn't drive the car and didn't entirely know what happened on the drive home, they noted that upon his return to the scene, he could fully comprehend what happened. It was after he fully understood what happened that he decided to conspire with Alton to cover up the killing. The AFCCA was not persuaded that Marable didn't understand the gravity of the crimes he committed while he pitched pieces of Alton's truck into the desert landscape. Had Marable continued to a contested court-martial, he faced a maximum exposure of 20 years of confinement and that dishonorable discharge. So 1 year and a DD was the deal of a lifetime. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we take a swipe at seized property. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, endorsed, or authorized by the Department of Defense.